Handeln miteinander vernetzen. Das
I'm happy to see a good crowd for a Monday afternoon and a very uneven date for our lectures, and also the third day of the semester. So I was hoping we fill the house, and we're almost about to, I guess, if more students trickle in. That's why we also started 8 minutes late, 8 minutes and 27 seconds late, which we will not do for future lectures. So students, please come in time next time. Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Architecture in the City Festival event tonight. A lecture by tonight's guest, Professor Keller Easterling, and the opening of the exhibition Examining Future Urban Conditions. My name is Mark Bückenheim, and I'm the graduate director of the School of Architecture here at the Academy of Art University. I also speak on behalf of my colleagues, Executive Director Mimi Sullivan, Undergraduate Director Jennifer Esselstein, Online Director Eric Lam, as well as the faculty of the School of Architecture. And I welcome you all, faculty and students, as well as outside guests tonight. Thank you for coming. Presented by the American Institute of Architects San Francisco and the Center for Architecture and Design, the annual Architecture and the City Festival is one of the nation's largest and longest running architectural and design festivals. We would like to thank the AASF and the Center for Architecture and Design for the inclusion of our event into this great festival. We especially thank Annabelle Udo O'Malley, who supported us in scheduling this event and making it part of the Architecture in the City Festival. I would also like to extend our thank you to President Stevens and Executive Director Mimi Sullivan for the strong support of tonight's event and many others that will happen throughout the semester. This brings me to the other events we have this fall semester that I would like to quickly highlight to you with this slide. Tonight, we have our guest Keller Easterling from New York, distinguished architect, writer, and professor at Yale University, and you will hear more about her and also from her in only a short while. I do promise, I really do. On September 27th, we welcome famous architectural photographer Julien Lanoux from Belgium. He will give us a very professional insight into the life of an architecture photographer traveling the world, and we will hopefully hear a bit of embarrassing gossip about well-known star architects in the process. On October the 4th, we have Jennifer Bonner from Mall, from Cambridge. On October the 8th, we welcome Jules Dingle from Dixau, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Jules Dingle will not only speak about the firm's great work, but also be leading our design build charrette at the School of Architecture this fall. On October the 16th, we will have Takaharu Tezuka from Tezuka Architects in Tokyo, Japan, a firm that he leads together with his wife, Yui Tezuka, and that has an international reach through their thoroughly considered buildings that serve as an outstanding precedent not only at our school, but for students and architects worldwide. On October the 30th, we will welcome Simon Frommenwieler from HHF Architects Basel, Switzerland. They teach or taught at many universities worldwide. Their buildings are in China, the US, Mexico, France, Germany, and Switzerland. And they teach at the Harvard GSD this semester and also at Yale School of Architecture starting this fall. On November the 7th, we will host our Ethics and Leadership panel series this semester with Johanna Hurme and Sasha Radulovic of 5468796 Architects. Very easy to remember firm name, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. On November 15th, we welcome Jose Mayoral Moratilla from Studio Practica, which he runs with Jaime da Roca Guerrero and Jose Ramon Sierra Gomez de Leon in Seville in Madrid, Spain, and also in Santiago de Chile. The lecture series concludes on November the 20th with Maurizio Peso and Sofia von Erichshausen of Pezo von Erichshausen from Concepcion, Chile, who I'm sure don't need any further introduction or description. We hope to see many of you in the next months for this lecture series. With tonight's lecture by Keller Easterling also comes the exhibition opening of Examining Future Urban Conditions, in which the School of Architecture is addressing city development and growth as both a global and local phenomenon. The theme of this year's Architecture in the City Festival, Future City, will be addressed in the dialogue initiated by our public lecture and which then continues in the presentation of the student work, examining political, technological, and environmental implications of future urbanism. You're all welcome to stay longer after the lecture and mingle among the works. We invite you to this. It is my great pleasure to welcome tonight's lecture guest, Keller Easterling, but as I already anticipated that I'm almost losing my voice by now, and as I feel that I also lack the beautiful eloquence to describe Keller Easterling's intriguing and thought-provoking work in sufficient terms, I asked architecture critic, educator, writer, and curator Dora Epstein-Jones to introduce Keller on behalf of me. Thank you very much, and please, Dora, do your magic in introducing Professor Keller Easterling. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to introduce our speaker tonight. I don't know if I'm magic, but I'll try. We're very fortunate to have Keller Easterling here tonight, as I can think of no other writer who significantly enriches the theme of this year's Architecture and the City Festival more than she. The provocation of the AIA-SF and the Center for Architecture and Design is, quote, future city. Typically, a future city, while forward-thinking in its ambitions, is actually quite a modernist notion, a sense of urgency in the present to empower oneself to make the future. Future cities are imbued with plenty of good intentions and somewhat utopian fantasies. They're progressive and human-centered, usually corrections to a current city that is viewed as ill, inadequate, or wrong. But, as the festival also suggests this year, through the sheer diversity of the practices that have been invited, we may already be living in an unknowable, uncertain future. Future city, in the context of this year's festival and in the context of San Francisco, may not be an answer to a question, but a much more impactful idea of multiple and heterogeneous approaches, a refusal of our own habits and prejudices in favor of both macro and micro, conserving and provoking, intervening and letting lie. Enter into this discussion tonight is Keller Easterling, a writer, theorist, architect, Yale professor, Biennale fixture, and what I prefer to call an architectural activist. Ms. Easterling possesses an uncanny ability to see contemporary conditions and to write and speak about these complex conditions of infrastructure, ecology, information, and the built environment with utter and consistent precision, and to do so long before any other writer in our field was even able to form the words. She was a landscape urbanist before landscape urbanism was a thing, an urban networks person before urban networks were a term. On top of whatever magic goggles that she seems to possess, Ms. Easterling has a deep sense of the reciprocal and potential roles of knowledge and practice. In writing that pulls no punches, she consistently returns us to our own approaches. Like we now see in this month's festival, the future is already happening. And she might insist, therefore, that we wake up, free ourselves from the boundaries of what we think we know, and act on the sneaky and pernicious spatial variables that already surround us. My current favorite Keller Easterling quote is this. Quote, this is her talking. Theory is the opposite of rhetorical paralysis. It is something impractical on its way to a new practical, something illogical, risky, harebrained, or hard. I can't believe that this line, illogical, risky, harebrained, or hard, wasn't written for any other city than San Francisco. San Francisco, please welcome Keller Easterling.
Should I turn this on? Oh, okay, thanks.
So thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it sounds like a fantastic lecture series, and thank you so much for that introduction. Those of you who don't know anything about my work, I always say that I'm sort of looking with half-closed eyes at the urban world, looking at buildings with shapes and outlines, but also the matrix of rules and relationships in which those buildings are suspended. And you could almost call it a kind of medium design. And in this contemporary experience economy, that matrix is usually made up of repeatable formulas or spatial products. You know what they are: skyscrapers, malls, golf courses, resorts, franchises, parking lots, airports, ports, free zones. And these this is a set of slides that I almost always show when I give a talk, just to sort of put in front of you what I mean by this kind of infrastructure space. Because it's not an infrastructure like pipes and wires under the ground, but more like an all too visible enveloping medium, or a kind of spatial technology, something like multiple spatial operating systems for the city. And this technological matrix is, for me, arresting, not only because of its weird mixtures of violence and candy-colored fairy tales, but also because it's a secret weapon of stealthy political power, because it's creating de facto forms of polity that are often outpacing law, and because it's rapidly 3D printing a new layer of the Earth's crust. But you know, beyond communication media, this kind of medium thinking or medium design is really a habit of mind that's ever present and practiced in many disciplines. You know, you think about how oncologists now are analyzing not only the tumor, but chemical fluctuations in the surrounding tissue, or actors transmit information not only in their lines, but in a string of interdependent actions that are unfolding in time, or geologists don't just taxonomize specimens, but read them as traces of a process. So ever present, but I would still say maybe under-rehearsed in culture in face of more dominant cultural habits. Because in some kind of fatal error, our beautiful, soft, watery human organisms somehow accidentally assume a command and control habit of mind that loves being right. It's a culture that's good at pointing to things and calling their name, but not so good at describing the relationships between things, the chemistries between things, or the repertoires that things enact. It's a culture that privileges declarations, right answers, universals, telos, elementary particles. You know, it's captivated by circular logics, modernist scripts that celebrate freedom and transcendent newness, narrative arcs that bend towards utopian or dystopian ultimates. So often it's a collective mind that looks for the one, or looks for the one and only. So often a mind that seems to be organized like a closed loop. And since a loop that only circulates compatible information can't abide contradiction, it often then lashes out with a binary fight against any challenge. So this collective mind, it favors successive rather than coexistent thoughts or practices. You know, the new right answer must kill the old right answer. We cry out with dramatic ideas of emancipation and freedom when that freedom is only a freedom that's robbing someone else of their freedom. So smart is confused with new, empowered is confused with free. These are the sort of hackneyed plot lines of our humanities, the binaries of war, the chest-beating Westphalian sovereignty of nations, those remain the darlings of history. Homo economicus allowed to upstage and hold forth. We're always pulling out our old sci-fi futurologies out of mothballs. And the whole thing, also has to build to a revolution or an apocalyptic burnout. But I want, with your permission, to say that we could think of those things as really laughably habitual thought. And when oscillating between loops and binaries, it's an unnecessarily violent culture that, having eliminated the very information it needs, is often banging away with the same blunt tools that are really completely inadequate to address perennial problems or contemporary chemistries of power. So then a bully is elected, a migration of refugees swells in number, financial crisis makes properties worth less than nothing, an industrial disaster kills thousands, shorelines flood due to global warming. And if there are economic and military templates that provide no explanation, or if new technologies don't somehow provide the solution, if the consensus surrounding laws and standards and master plans provides no relief, it's as if the smartest people in the world are standing with hand to brow, and dissent, adopting the same binary, also exists in a world of enemies and innocents. And since the world's big bullies and bulletproof forms of power thrive on this oscillation between loop and binary, it's as if there's nothing to counter them. Nothing to counter things like the orange one. Only what have we got? Only more ways of fighting and being right and providing the very rancor that nourishes their violence. So how do you drop through a trap door and engage the flip side of these logics? On that flip side, I'll be showing you throughout maybe, did we drop the image there? Okay. I think we've lost the image. So I was about to say that um, uh, that throughout this talk, I'll be showing you little bits of urban porn that come from the kinds of spaces I usually look at from the promotional videos for the spaces that I look at, and this is one of them. Now it's playing. Because I wanted to say, it's a good place for the bulb to go off, because I was wondering, what is on that flip side? On that flip side, nothing is new and nothing is right. There wouldn't be any dramatic manifestos. There would only be a chance to rehearse a habit of mind that's been eclipsed. It would be something you already know how to do. Like you already know how to detect, like I was saying, sort of with half-closed eyes, a world that's at a different focal length. And rather than only declarations and right answers and objects and determinations, you can detect and manipulate a medium or a matrix as it changes over time. And even for a broader audience, the things that we think about might be incredibly relevant, since just as this medium thinking inverts the typical focus on object over field, maybe it can even invert some approaches to the mechanics and aesthetics and politics of stubborn problems. So I know many here are architects, but we could be speaking to any discipline or treating anyone as a designer. And medium design might use space to prompt productive thought about spatial and non-spatial problems. So putting us in a sort of leadership position. Even like those media theorists who, not bound, you were saying before, not bound by communication technologies, are returning to these more elemental understandings of media. We can think of medium design as the design and the lumpy, heavy material of a heavy information system, where space itself is a broad, inclusive mixing chamber for many social, political, and technical networks. Space doesn't need the screens and sensors of the Internet of Things to make its stiff arrangements dance. It's already dancing. And even at a moment of digital ubiquity and innovation, space may be the underexploited medium of innovation, with the capacity to make other information systems dumber or smarter. So while exceeding, this is exceeding an understanding of media in terms of mass communication, but still drawing on a scaffold of thought that would include Harold Ennis or Marshall McLuhan, or that does rely on the kind of non-modern thinking that accompanies Bruno Latour as he steps away from hierarchies or ultimates. It's related to the focus on disposition that fascinates Michel Foucault or Jojo Agamben or Gilbert Ryle. And there's an awareness of the reverberations of aesthetic practices and cultural networks about which someone like Rancière would write. Or from J.J. Gibson, there's a sense of affordances of things. Or from Gregory Bateson, not only that sense of heavy space as an information system, as he said, a man, a tree, and an axe as an information system, but even a sense of temperament in the interplay of things. And maybe these large, oh, it happened again. Okay.
slide back so I can see if we're getting it in the computer? Oh yeah, we're good. Yes.
So we're there. Thank you so much. It must be really tough to fix that under all that pressure. So all our heroes. Okay, so thank you. Yes. So I was saying maybe the very socio-technical systems which I was talking to you about before, the repeatable formulas for formatting all the space around the world, are even very good to think with because they're everywhere and nowhere. From the micro to the macro scale, from institutions to cities, they're too large or too widely distributed to be assessed as a discrete object with a name or shape or outline. They don't respond to singular solutions and determinations, and they can only really be assessed by the activity or disposition immanent in their organization as it unfolds over time and territory. But in any context, large or small, designing the medium is managing the potentials and relationships between objects, the activity or disposition that's immanent in their organization. So the disposition of any organization makes some things possible and some things impossible, or like a growth medium, it determines what will survive, or like an operating system, it sets the rules of the game that link and activate components of a relationship. It may be our histories and new dramatic futures or lubricated freedoms and emancipation on this flip side don't make sense. And however unlikely it may seem, in medium design, you would discover extra political and aesthetic capacities, even redoubled territory of operation in unlikely places, in interplay, in indeterminacy, in failure, in heavy information, in discrepancy, and latent temperament in organizations. Since unreasonable politics easily unravels reasonable politics, and we have great examples of that, luckily, in medium design, being right is a really bad idea. It's way too weak. It doesn't work against gurus and totalitarian bullies. And maybe it cultures spectacular failures together with some underexploited powers of medium, inspire alternative ways to register the design imagination, form making in another key or part of speech. We as designers are very good at making things, with shapes and outlines, but medium design is less like making a thing and more like having your hands on the faders and toggles and dials of organization. It's the design of interdependencies, chain reactions, ratchets. Maybe it benefits from an artistic curiosity about reagents in mixtures, designing not a single object, but a platform for inflecting populations of objects. There would be an artistic comfort with dynamic markers and unfinished processes. The dispositions of space then manipulated not with right answers and solutions and master plans, but with something more like time-released, active forms, multipliers, switches, or some other organ of interplay that has an extended temporal dimension that allows the design to unfold and remain in play. So medium design would then be something like playing pool, where knowing one fixed sequence of shots doesn't do you any good, but being able to see branching networks of possibilities allows you to add more information to the table. In pool, you don't know that, like you know the right answer. You know how, like knowing what to do next. To respond to a string of changing conditions. It's not indeterminate to be equivocal or vague or somehow unknowable, but it sounds contradictory. It's indeterminate to be practical. So how do you practically design an organ of interplay? For instance, usually in design, you know, in the design we're used to, you can only kind of add an object, you know, add built material. But if you consider an interplay of spatial variables that's adjusting an ecology of building, ebbs and flows, you could even think about the subtraction of architecture in floodplains or in distended suburbs. And I won't go into detail about this protocol, but it imagines reverse engineering the mortgage that's been a multiplier of sprawl and even global financial and environmental disaster. And it asks, you know, what if you introduce interplay by simply considering mortgages in groups that are rated for complementary or counterbalancing attributes that reduce collective risk? And anything can be gamed. Any kind of interplay could be either dangerous or productive, but an interplay might have enough temporal dimension to react to changing conditions or to respond to the moment when it's outmaneuvered. It's not a solution then, it's something that shouldn't always work. And so designing something like this protocol that is indeterminate to be practical is something like medium design. And replacing the kind of parboiled master plans, what are the pop culture, cinematic, time-lapse documents that show these ratcheting changes? Those flooded properties I was just showing you only become available in failure. It's like cities in like Detroit or New Orleans where the city fathers throw up their hands and say, you know, it's here, the financials just don't work. That's the moment where medium design where you can kind of roll up your sleeves. Think about those properties I was just showing you that when financially underwater, in such spectacular failure, ceased to be trafficked mortgage products and returned to being land and buildings in weather and gravity. And so while in a world of closed loops, organizations and institutions try to eliminate error, medium design actually works better when you multiply problems and when you use them to leaven and catalyze each other. It's a little bit like that very counterintuitive game theory called Parando's paradox. That pairs losing games to generate wins, and the losses create a kind of ratcheting traction to create small gains. So in medium design, it's not even really the content of a problem, but it's just the interplay between problems that's important. Beyond the newness and succession of technologies is then the relationship between technologies. So that field of failed and emergent technologies in interplay makes an ever-present wilderness that redoubles the territory and material for design ecologies. So even without digital devices, the heavy spatial information system is dancing with potentials that are essential to innovation and governance. So smart then, you know, when we all say smart city and so on, smart may mean not one supposedly transcendent species of information, but smart means mixtures of different kinds of information, like the digital together with the heavy or the spatial. Here's another protocol of interplay with completely different content. You know, in the jungles of Kenya, where this is the forest of the Amazon, you know that there's already a strong relationship between roads and erasure of the forest. Like we usually think of roads as conduits of progress and opportunity, or the means to deliver infrastructure like broadband in rural or wilderness areas. But we also know that they can erase information in those cities that's imminent in the landscape, in the cities, in the villages. if you're thinking of those landscapes and cities and villages as themselves an information system. You've all seen images like this. So this protocol considers an interplay between broadband, roads, and forest or jungle. It argues that it might be more productive to dial down roads, the gray lines, when dialing up broadband, the red radiating circle, to preserve farms and forests, which is the green information system that attracts more resources for tourism or for education. So here, digital and spatial platforms can make each other more information rich or more information poor. And you see a road, as well as a bit of code, hacking a telecommunications network. Medium design, also like Pool, is a game that's surrounded by hustlers, and it has a currency and discrepancy. So to assess and manipulate medium is almost as if you have to cultivate a capacity to see in a split screen, to sort of straddle mental partitions between the nominative and the active or dispositional. I often think it's something like developing a canine mind, where you hear your human saying the words, good girl, and you've learned what those words, good girl, mean, but a dog would never rely on a kind of one-to-one assigned meaning. Instead, they're looking at you for 1,000 other affective cues, how close you are to the door or the dog bowl, or whether you have a leash in your hand, or even your temperament. So in this split screen, you're sort of turning the sound down on those declarations. It's easier to detect the difference between what an organization is saying and what it's doing. How organizations decouple their messages from their real activity and underlying disposition. So if you're better at detecting disposition in medium, then it's easier to sort of see in a split screen the difference between the stories and the disposition. On one side of the screen, there are stories about the kinds of socio-technical networks that I study, whether they're railroads or hydroelectric networks or blockchains, and the script that accompanies them is almost always about decentralization and freedom, just like this. This is, the Ethereum logo, right? But the real disposition of the organization may actually be concentrating power and authority, or have a kind of, universal ambition. Or the smart city, maintains the shine of the new, even when it centralizes information in its disposition, even when it violates privacy, even when the network is primitive and crude in disposition. A dumb binary of likes and dislikes filters a social media network that purports to be information rich. A global network of Dubai-style zone cities facilitates not free trade, which is its story, but manipulated trade. Or a centralizing power espouses a populist message. Or the world's superbugs and bulletproof forms of power, they may be masters of demagoguery and binary head-on brutality. They will, until the end, punch and counterpunch, but they're also masters of that split screen. Like the confidence man, they know how lies work. And just like being right is a really bad idea in medium design, telling one lie is a really bad idea. Telling many lies, though, works very well. One lie calls for reconciliation and truth, but many lies creates a kind of Teflon on which rationality begins to slip and slide. And the superbug knows how lies can be made to dance around and fascinate in the absence of meaning and information. Lies are everywhere, and they animate and insulate, they lubricate, and the discrepancy that all the sort of righteous people are futilely trying to reconcile is the perfect material for fully mediated rumor and contagious fictions that are battering the walls, working the back channels. So, and again, it's not what lies say, it's sort of how they bounce. The superbug then can become pure medium, activity divorced from content, from meaning. If you're considering putting a few of these ideas together, considering interplay, interdependence, failure, heavy information, and discrepancy altogether, here's a supersaturated story, you know, about automated vehicles. Automated vehicles are supposed to be now the means to perfect driving, reduce emissions, increase productivity. But as I think, as you all know, in this kind of pure embrace of a new technology, there's a boomerang effect. If automated vehicles are, you know, provide the same hands-free ride as does transit, and if they're used in lieu of transit, imagine every seat in a transit car the size of a car, they will create a form of congestion that's unprecedented. So that you will have a very smart vehicle and just a very dumb traffic jam. And in our usual habits of mind, then, to remedy that boomerang effect, the only thing we could do is have another new technology. It would be we need a solution in the next emergent technology like futuristic flying cars or something like that. But an alternative response that would be more in the habit of mind of medium design is to alter a relationship between technologies, or to rewire the network even with a spatial variable in a spatial information system, in a heavy information system, a physical architectural volume that acts like a switch when placed between existing transportation networks. So the switch, just an intermodal node for upshifting and downshifting into transportation of different capacities, up into transit or down into walking and cycling or something like that. It turns out may offer the best model for organizing the maintenance, the innovation, the investment, even the liability for this shifting transportation ecology. So designing that switch would be something like medium design, and, you know, would come with architectural solids that we're used to making. It would come with volumes. But then if you really wanted to do it, if you really wanted to reduce emissions and sprawl while increasing the ridership of transit and increasing the ridership of AVs, you'd also have to have the stomach for the spin that went with it. Here I'm showing you this kind of silly soft focus image of Grand Central. But you'd also have to be working both sides of the screen with a sort of sneaky story telling the soft focus ads that portray the seduction of switching. And that story, you'd have to have a story that would pry the car from the cold, dead hands of Americans. So while we might be bored with the safety of the purely rhetorical, the design that has any hope of affecting change has to manipulate the organization, the space, the arrangement, as well as the narrative that attends it, with moves that are sneakier or more politically agile. And it may be a dissonant story that, however non-physical, has physical consequences. Or it may be a narrative that makes something contagious, or that generates a Teflon surface of its own. Or it may have an emotional message that renders some power more vulnerable, or it may just have a surprising cultural bounce because of its irrationality, or its outrageousness, or its cuteness, or its creepiness, or its violence. to observe these organizations in this kind of canine split screen, not only the stories and lies on one side, but also the actual disposition of the organization on another, is to observe temperament in organization. And it's not something we usually think about, but a potential for concentrating or distributing power, as well as potential for escalating or reducing violence. And the free zones that I study really graphically model culture's violent tendency to form loops that only circulate compatible information and expel any incompatible or inconvenient circumstance, any challenger or other, like the worker. Workers always on the receiving end of violence in these environments that are also ironically saturated with management ease about best practice acronyms and bullet-pointed lists and mandalas and motivational aphorisms that often only inoculate power against change. Again, the loop keeps closing. The house is always winning and then squaring off in a binary against the worker. And punctuating events like crises, competitions, victories, defeats, those are the things that usually capture the most familiar cultural narratives, the imagination and attention of the most familiar cultural narratives. But in medium design, disposition doesn't happen because it's ever present as a latent quality. Just like glass doesn't have to break to be brittle, dispositional qualities are changing and unfolding. So this is the Rana Plaza collapse. And if an unsafe factory collapses or burns, there is an event to mark the violence, and we know what to do with that. But in countless factories or industrial parks that don't happen to buckle under the weight of their own denial and violence, it's not the violence of the explosion or the gunshot or the drawn sword. Instead, there's only constant aggressions, blatant, imbalanced power dynamics. And medium design might be a way of detecting and manipulating that latent temperament. And in the histories, you would be then telling not only the story of things that shouldn't always work, but history of things that don't happen. And it might be structured like an epidemiology or branching set of thresholds and points of leverage. It might be concerned with how to modulate violence in organizations by making them more information rich. So in this funny history, we would be looking for gradients of political metastasis and remission, like the amazing shift in temperament in Stanley Kubrick's 1960 movie Spartacus. I don't know if you've seen it or if you're too young, but here's the story. In Spartacus, a Roman authority gathers a whole bunch of slaves shackled together in front of them and says that only Spartacus, the insurgent Spartacus, will be crucified, and the rest of them will be spared if Spartacus will reveal himself. And Kirk Douglas, who's Spartacus, is about to stand up and say, "I am Spartacus." And then Tony Curtis, a fellow slave, stands up and says at the exact same time, "I am Spartacus." And then all the slaves stand up all at once saying, "I am Spartacus, I am Spartacus, I am Spartacus." And suddenly in that weird gradient, everything shifts, and the Roman authorities are forced to, are sort of disarmed and forced to extinguish all of their slaves. And similarly, there's countless ways to adjust the solids and liquids of the urban world to reduce violence and tension. It's a little bit like the material advantage in a chess game. Beyond market value, urban morphologies and typologies and relationships embody potentials. They concentrate or distribute power. They have the power. They have a latent temperament, a power to include or exclude. And the urbanity we often favor relies on breaking loops and binaries by multiplying and diversifying components, by placing them in interdependent relationships. So the typical idea of disposition is that disposition is like a ball on an inclined plane. You know, it can be latent. The ball doesn't have to roll down the hill. So in medium design, can you adjust stories and organizational potentials on both sides of the screen in ways that are attuned to latent temperament? So in addition to the master plans and declarations that we make, would we be something more like a parent who has to come in and break up two squabbling children? And when you are a parent with squabbling children, you never litigate the argument, the content of the argument that the two are having. Instead, you alter disposition. You increase the blood sugar of one child. You open the window. You introduce a pet into the arms of the other child. You're changing the potentials for violence in the chemistry of the room. So consider another latent temperament, a project that I was showing you as you were walking in. All the global infrastructure space that I study is perfectly streamlined, the global movement of billions of products, tens of millions of tourists and cheap laborers. But at a time when 65 million people in the world are displaced, more than at any other time in the history of the planet, somehow there's no way to move X million people away from atrocities like those in Syria. The nation state only has a dumb on-off button for granting citizenship or asylum. Again, it's a closed loop that lashes out with a binary, this time against the immigrant. And the extra-state layers of governance, like the NGocracy, offer as their best idea storage in a refugee camp, a form of detention lasting on average 17 years. Actually, if the free zones that I've been showing you are kind of the chief nodes for privileged movements of goods and people outside the constraints of national law, the refugee camp is almost its kind of perverse carceral cousin. And the migrations of recent years have been especially violent and polarizing, where migration is portrayed not as the constant that it has been through history, but as a kind of crisis that needs the solution. And those migrating are portrayed as victims or the other, again, in this kind of binary opposition with right-wing xenophobic sentiments. So if you wanted to alter the temperament and dispositional potential of this organization, could you move away maybe from the sharp end of the conflict and work on some remote set of switches and larger networks? Could you counter the violence of the loop and binary and work on the medium to multiply, so not one and binary, but a way to multiply one-to-one exchanges that have historically supported some of the most successful travel. So if you could do this dispositionally and temperamentally, you might be moving away from the one, the loop, and the binary to the one-to-one and the many. And Many is the name of an online platform that I've been working on that's designed to facilitate migration through an exchange of needs. So it first refuses to regard migrating people as victims, and it serves those who want to resettle, but also those who want to keep traveling, who never wanted the citizenship that the nation withholds or reluctantly bestows. So it's a platform that speaks for those who might say, I don't really want your citizenship or your victimhood or your structured racism or your bad jobs. I don't want to stay. So also dispositionally, it's trying to kind of rob the right wing of its best argument and leave the right wing to kind of throw itself against an open door. So though it's speaking for those who might say, we don't want your citizenship. Instead, we want a kind of cosmopolitan mobility that's based on a more robust networking of short-term project-based visas that can be aggregated for global credentials. So this many platform, and it's, I present it to you for critique, but it's asking if there could be a kind of a global form of matchmaking between the sideline talents and needs of migrating population and a multitude of needs all around the world. So there are no haves and have-nots. Only needs, as with Parando's paradox, only needs and problems that can be put together, that are the necessary assets of this chemistry. And cities can then bargain with their underexploited, often failed spaces to attract a changing influx of talent and resources, matching their needs with the needs of mobile people to generate mutual benefits. Space and time, failures, problems, and opportunities for training in non-market exchanges. And might this cosmopolitan mobility organize around intervals of time or seasons of life to form a more agile or practical approach? And might the spatial variables that we know about have more authority in global governance? And this is the platform that we were just sort of trying to rehearse at the Venice Biennale, in which we're continuing to develop. But in no way pretends that the visa game is not a fraught and dangerous place to be. It's not a sunny one world sharing app. And this medium design is arguing for mixtures of information and systems that don't privilege new technology. So you might be asking, well, then why is she making an app? But this is, in a way, the app is not the object of design. It's just an aggregator or prompt for re-aggregating spatial variables in a heavy information system in cities. It's kind of low tech, like a bulletin board or a slot machine. And is also developing a kind of graphic conceit where the more heterogeneous or lumpy the information, the more trustworthy it is. A nod to Fluxus member Jurgis Makunis' Spell Your Name with These Objects, or Paul Elliman's typographies, or hobo code, or cuneiform. So I'm now asking, can this platform avoid the very dangers that it critiques? And can these strings, more like strings of journeys, be anticipated, celebrated, accredited as again, not the mark of a victim, but the mark of the highly prized, linguistically talented diplomats and leaders of the world? And again, can it move from the one and the binary to the one-to-one and the many? And might some of the world's other seemingly intractable and unresponsive problems, superbugs, bulletproof forms of power, losing games, could they respond to medium design? And with an ability to detect and manipulate interplay and indeterminacy and failure and heavy information and discrepancy and latent temperament, what potentials are there for a stealthier form of activism? Playing both sides of the screen with messy, impure, non-modern mixtures of spatial change and the gifts and pandas and rumors and meaningless distractions and other totemic fictions that are so effective in culture. So here, finally, on this flip side, right answers are mistakes, obligations are more empowering than freedom, histories follow latent aggressions as well as gunshots, messy is smarter than new, you deliberately address problems with responses that shouldn't always work, and maybe you can steal some of the the powers of infrastructure space to design a snaking chain of moves that worms into and generates leverage against intractable politics. And like a really good pool player, you don't necessarily call your shots, but keep them guessing. So it would be like being too smart to be right. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long because of all the changes.
We open this for questions at this point. Thank you very much.
Keller, thank you for this talk, and sorry for the technical difficulties, but everything's social before it's technical, so socially we're fine. I'm wondering about the use of the word medium in this, you know, especially given that you know, it's one of those words that with, you know, Sarah Whiting and Michael Meredith, you know, I mean, it's one that's been used in architecture before to very different effects and ideas, and it at appearance doesn't seem to match the ambitions of you know, this kind of super heterogeneous, you know, genius, messy kind of, you know, seizing. It speaks more to, yeah, like you understand, it speaks more to a kind of midline, a balance, you know, not so much this, not so much that. Can you speak more about what you mean by medium?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I chose to use that word is because I have colleagues who are media theorists, and as I was saying, they are returning or want to return to elemental uses of the word medium, to you know, the way the word medium originally was used to mean middle, or milieu, or surrounding environments of air, earth, wind, fire. And media theorists are wanting to do that not only to deal with sort of larger environmental issues and digital ubiquity, but they're feeling that they don't have you know, they're sort of in crisis, wondering, you know, how do we're not trained to, you know, somehow work with these things. The history of media theory is still often bracketed by communication technologies. So in a way, some of this work is meant to kind of offer to not only media theorists, but many that I mentioned, from oncologists to people in many other disciplines, who are looking to matrix instead of object. And I'm saying that we actually have a really good, really explicit way. We're skilled we're good at this. We could do this. We can even offer it to others to use the matrix space that maybe we have sometimes ignored, but that I've certainly paid a lot of attention to, the kind of infrastructure space that's rapidly changing the globalizing world, that this puts us in kind of a really interesting position to offer to many different disciplines evidence that makes us more and more aware of the dangers and unexpected political capacities of that space, but that it also models another habit of mind as well for spatial and non-spatial problems. But you make me aware that, I hadn't really anticipated Whiting and Meredith as things that I should think about. I sailed over that, so I should go back.
No, if that might be a good thing. Yeah. to sail past that, but it is, you know, I mean, it is an interesting provocation on their side, because theirs is a kind of like, in the face of heterogeneity, I got nothing, right? Whereas yours seems to be like, in the face of heterogeneity, we have everything, right? You know, and I think then I would emphasize the design portion of that, right? And that that design is the kind of thing that we do best, that
Yes.
if I understand that correctly. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I mean, there's a couple of different talks that I use to talk about medium design, and for some reason tonight I did the one that was a little bit more, I don't know, advanced into the ideas rather than kind of taking baby steps into it, because I figured this was the audience for that. But this is absolutely practical thinking about design. A mode of practice that we are working on to deal with urgent problems, physical problems.
Thank you very much. Could you elaborate a little bit more about your thoughts about the actors in medium design? As you were talking, I was kind of getting a picture of an individual, you know, the pool player, the stealthy activist that's moving laterally between all these systems and stuff, but that's not realistic. And particularly if you're saying this is a very practical thing, what is a medium design team in your conception?
Yeah, I think it's a team. It's a team. And I don't know about you all, but I notice in my own students that often what they're wanting when they're coming to school is a chance to find a way, is a chance to make that network of partners in different disciplines, and who, you know, with whom they can work on the wicked problems, because they really don't want to be just confined in our architecture society hierarchies. That's an unsustainable proposition anyway. So it's they're taking a more entrepreneurial position, and by entrepreneur I don't mean, you know, a commercial entrepreneur. In fact, the kind of startup culture, Stanford D School kind of culture stuff that we see universities taking up doesn't work for this. You know, I think innovation is the interplays that one would be inventing. They are inventions, but the advent of that kind of invention or innovation, I think, looks a lot different from startup culture launching, you know. So it's asking a lot of our students to, you know, be able to deploy their skills in such a novel way, under-rehearsed, well, not novel, but under-rehearsed way. But
thank you very much for being very inspiring. My question is, how do you stop this momentum of the contagion that you are, that you say is the binary aspect? Because sometimes that contagion can also breed another kind of binary response. And you're asking all of us to be thoughtful and skilled, and the skills that and I'm now thinking about the real world, similar to Mallory's question. The skill that I also see is that you have to be a very skilled person in the government setting, because we watch all these, you can watch the local news and see what's being approved and not approved. And they're all, the members that are on the board are all falling into, you know, this, it's not even, there's no network, right? They're operating on discrete information that's not even interconnected. And these are governmental people that make big policies. And so my question to you is, like what we call the transportation center at Salesforce, it has now become the Grand Central of the West. So it repeated itself on the West Coast. Not a lot of thoughtful connectors to other buildings or what happens to the fabric of downtown. So that's like a good example. How do we get around all of that? You know, you need an intelligent team, you need financiers, you need good people in government that are outspoken. You need the thoughts and skills of the students in this audience, practitioners.
Yeah.
You know, I'm trying to figure out how do we share this with our students so that we become the activists we want to.
Yeah. Well, I don't have, you know, sort of obviously don't have answers, but I also, when working with my design students, and at Yale I teach a whole range of students. I teach all those students, you know, who are going to be the little McKinsey consultants. You know, I teach outside of the architecture school, so all the students that are going to work for Deloitte, who are going to be, you know, like the global decision makers. They're not as smart as my design students. They're not as good at correlative thinking. And so I often I'm not saying to my design students, oh, you should go and get an extra policy degree, or you should do this in government, or something like that. It's not that one it wouldn't be aware of that, or wouldn't want to partner in robust ways, but I am arrogantly arguing that those students who are getting the Deloitte and McKinsey degrees, who are going to be the CIA agents or something, they need to know about what we do. That I'm trying to make spatial practices have another authority in global governance, but also just in global decision making. So not always waiting for government, but working around in social, political, even commercially entrepreneurial ways.
Hi, thank you for the really great lecture. This kind of paradigm shifting. In the lecture, I was quite speculating the relationship that you're bringing between high performance objects and the medium thinking, because it seems like the high performance objects are kind of byproducts of binary thinking and close the loop. However, when we commonly think about this types of medium thinking that you're telling us here, we normally assume the byproducts of the binary thoughts and the super high performance objects to be there in the background to help us to get the medium thinking and the results to come out. For example, for the Manny project and the app, we would have to assume that there will be, you know, fast reception and, you know, signal towers, bandwidth, and all of these things in the background to even run our medium thinking. So I was wondering kind of this relationship. It's not against each other, how you think about it. Yeah.
Right. No, you're absolutely right when you're talking about these sort of high performance technologies. So for me, so there's the high performance technologies, and we can keep thinking, oh well, we will progress by making higher and higher performance technologies, and that's, you know, that's true in some ways. But what I'm arguing is something that tries to think of those together with the things we've already made. And it comes from someone that I studied a long time ago, Benton Mackay, who talked about there being a kind of constant wilderness in the relationships between the newest technologies and the incumbent technologies. That the interplay between those is a kind of redoubled territory to work with. So you're not just relying on existing or incumbent technologies, but nor are you relying just on there being kind of the next new technology to solve the problem. So it's a kind of interplay between what we've already made and the newest things that we've made. So it's like, you know, so if you see what I mean, in Mackay, it came up with this idea because the planet, the North and South Pole had just been discovered, and he was saying, okay, so the so the whole planet's now been kind of mapped in some way. How do we kind of roll back in the other direction to find a wilderness in the stuff we've already made? And it's that is the inspiration for thinking about what is more information rich? Is it more information rich to have the newest data technologies and digital technologies, or is it more information rich to mix those with spatial information systems, heavy information systems? That's sort of what I'm trying to play around with.
Thank you, Keller. Very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask you to expand on something I'm noticing. So the heterogeneity that you've talked about, so by logical extension, it would mean that the medium design has to coexist at the same time with the kinds of approaches that it is critiquing simultaneously. So in other words, we all, whichever program we subscribe to, we have to learn to sit with not just the ones that we vote for or that we want to pursue, and so we can't proselytize. So the interplay between medium design and the rest, could you expand on your thinking on what that interplay would be like?
Well, I guess I'm sort of thinking there might be an open circuit, an easy way to take up things that other people think have failed, like that are remaindered, that have been discarded, that if you can work with the potentials of those things, nobody's really going to bother you, while you're doing that. So kind of, I suppose it's, politically and technically working against expectations, or at least that's what I'm hoping. There might be kind of an open path to doing that kind of work, but it's not excluding the new. It's just not relying entirely on the new, and it's so it's not creating kind of yet another binary against the new. It's just embracing a larger field. I don't know if that is addressing your question. Are there any questions? Okay, great.
Designers to look for these overlooked, underused, or discarded opportunities, and quietly on their own, without fanfare, make changes.
Well, or maybe fanfare is necessary. As I was saying, this is not for, if you want to do it, you also have to have the stomach for the story that makes it contagious. It's not. I don't think it's a story of the long-suffering architect. I think it's the story of like a sneaky architect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I appreciate you coming. It was very thought-provoking. Thank you all for coming to the lecture, and I hope to see you in future lectures during this semester. Thank you.